It was just another night in Northern California. 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Jensen were your typical young couple on a secret date down in Lake Herman Road in Benicia. The romantic evening was soon interrupted by a criminal who would later be known as the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer is responsible for one of the most famous serial killer cold cases. Internet sleuths and professional detectives have been trying to crack the code and find the real killer for decades. Despite their efforts, they were always left empty-handed. Over half a century has passed now. Could the truth finally be revealed? The Zodiac Killer is responsible for one of the most famous serial killer cold cases. Internet sleuths and professional detectives have been trying to crack the code and find the real killer for decades. Despite their efforts, they were always left empty-handed. Over half a century has passed now. Could the truth finally be revealed? The Zodiac Killer terrorized Northern California throughout the 1960s and 70s. He was smart, taunting, and a cutthroat psychopath. Young couples in California could not escape the fear that their executioner may be waiting, watching, and ready to strike them next.
On December 20th, 1968, we arrived at the scene after a motorist informed us that he found two bodies. It was about 11 p.m. when the killer fired shots at the back of a couple. David was shot in the head with a .22 rifle inside the car, while Betty was shot 5 times in the back as she attempted to escape.
The Zodiac Killer struck again on July 4th of 1969. 22-year-old Darlene Farron and 19-year-old Michael McGowan were parked in Blue Rock Springs Park when they were approached by the Zodiac Killer, mistaking him for a police officer. Darlene was shot 9 times and unfortunately passed, while Michael was shot 4 times with a 9mm semi-automatic pistol but thankfully survived, making him one of the 2 only survivors of the Zodiac and gave the first description of the killer.
He was a bigger white male standing at about 5'8", with a large face and short curly light brown hair, and he was also dressed in dark clothing.
After the bodies were found, the Vallejo Police Department received a call from a public telephone 2 blocks away from the scene. The man on the other line described the scene of the murder in vast detail, admitting to the crimes as well as the double murder a year ago in Benicia, taunting the police. A month after the second killing, on August 1st, multiple identical letters from the Zodiac were received by the Vallejo Times-Herald, in which he claimed to have been responsible for the previous murders and stated that they would become his slaves in the afterlife. The letters contained different parts of a cryptogram that the Zodiac claimed would have the answer to his identity. He threatened to continuously kill people over the weekend if the paper editors did not publish his cryptogram in the papers, and was successful. Only about 2 months later, the Zodiac Killer struck again. On September 22nd, 20-year-old Brian Hartnell and 22-year-old Cecilia Shepard became the next victims of the Zodiac at Lake Brescia, in which the 2 were stabbed numerous times after being tied up. Before the Zodiac left the scene, he left a message on Brian's car that read the dates of his previous attacks along with the signature of the circle cross. An hour later, the Zodiac made another call to the police department describing the scene and claiming responsibility. Cecilia inopportunely passed, but Brian survived, making him the final survivor of the Zodiac and lived to tell us his story about his close encounter with death and a similar description of the Zodiac's appearance.
I considered him a robber. I had absolutely no thought that he was anything but that. And when we were at this robbery stage, I didn't consider any real threat to my life or to the girl or anything. I really didn't consider this, but I really wanted to help him. And
did he seem as though he would like your help at all?
No, he didn't, and he didn't even end up taking the money. But I
bear no grudge.
Well, of course not. I don't think that he was acting under his total complete consciousness. And when a man is, if you don't mind using the word sick, you can't hold this against them. But the real concern that I have is that he doesn't do this again. I'd like to see some people save this experience.
fourth victim of the Zodiac Killer was Paul Stein, a taxi driver working a late-night shift on October 11th to fund his college tuition. At about 9:59 p.m., a block away from his passenger's destination, Paul was shot in the head with a 5mm semi-automatic. Three individuals witnessed the attack as well, as the Zodiac Killer going through his belongings, ripping off a piece of Paul Stein's shirt, and finally, the unmasked Zodiac Killer's face. The primary suspect in the Zodiac killings was Arthur Lee Allen, a school teacher who was fired for sexually assaulting children and sent to live with his parents, minutes away from the first crime scene. He had numerous possessions that suggested a relation to the Zodiac Killer, such as his Zodiac watch, royal typewriter, and that he had mentioned to his friends his desire to kill couples and taunt the police, as well as a knife he owned being similar to the one used in the third killing. Survivor Michael McGow stated that Arthur was the man who shot him by identifying him through a photo lineup of 1968 driver's licenses as well. Though these clues pointed to Allen being the Zodiac, his handwriting and DNA didn't match up with the Zodiac Killer's. Richard Gaikowski was also suspected to be the Zodiac. He had a background as an army medic in which he would have the knowledge to use clothing as bandages and create homemade weapons similar to the Zodiac. He lived 5 miles from the first murder site, and he began working for the Good Times, a pro-violence and anti-police paper, in 1969. He wrote a fictional story about a group called the Berkeley Revolutionary Committee for Business, in which they would engage and humiliate cops in San Francisco on July 4th, 1969, the same day of the second attack. Finally, police dispatcher Nancy Slovert identified the Zodiac Killer's voice with Richard's. The final suspect, who has recently gained popularity thanks to his grandson's TikTok videos, is Richard Hoffman. Hoffman has numerous qualities that correlate with the Zodiacs, such as his handwriting and uncommon spelling errors of words such as until with 2 L's. He lived in the Vallejo area during the time of the murders, and he was also a police officer, which would allow him to have access to inside knowledge. One of the Zodiac's victims, Sherry Bates, was likely killed by Hoffman, as he called the LA Times on March 13th of 1971, stating that the Zodiac left his initials on a poem at the murder site, which read RF. Hoffman was also in charge of a juvenile unit on the day of the second killing, yet he didn't report seeing anyone, although he was supposedly patrolling the area. We've concluded that Richard Hoffman is the Zodiac Killer for numerous reasons that set him apart from the rest, one of which is his similar misspellings. Words like until appear in Hoffman and the killer's writings misspelled in the exact same way, until with 2 L's. Furthermore, his writing creates a direct correlation to the murder of Sherry Bates, which was confirmed to be done by the Zodiac. On top of this, Richard Hoffman was in the perfect position to taunt the police. He had the ranks infiltrated. This would explain his ability to taunt the police in proximity without being caught. Moreover, his convenient miss of any activity during the second killing is extremely incriminating, considering he was on duty patrolling, specifically as a juvenile unit. As a final point, the other suspects are far more unlikely because of their loose actual connections to any of the murders. The other suspects presented only had certain things in common with the Zodiac Killer, like skills and materials, unlike Richard Hoffman, who was directly linked to the murder of Sherry Bates through his grammar. Despite numerous investigations and countless theories explored, the Zodiac Killer remains as one of California's most chilling and terrifying cold cases. The 5-decade-long question still stands. Will we ever truly know the Zodiac Killer?